Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, president of LPB. I'm here with Robert Travis Scott, who's the president of the Public Affairs Research Council, our moderator for this evening. Robert, welcome.
Good evening. Well, since the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and several other high-profile officer-involved shootings of African Americans, body cameras have been gaining popularity among police departments. Advocates for the cameras say they lead to the de-escalation of tense situations. Footage from these cameras has also exonerated police officers falsely accused of using excessive force.
Well, everyone seems to agree that body-worn cameras have their advantages. But what is the best way to use them? Should police officers have the discretion to turn them on and off? How do they work and how expensive are they? What privacy issues do they raise? And what is the role of the press when it comes to the footage? Over the next hour, we'll hear from law enforcement representatives, legal experts, and journalists as we explore these issues and more on Police POV, Body Cameras in Louisiana.
Nowadays, you have to assume everything you're doing is being recorded anyway. Everybody carries around a phone. And, you know, we pull up on scenes now, and the first thing I see is I get out of my car, people holding their cameras up.
That's Lake Charles Chief of Police Don Dixon. His officers will also be recording come April.
We want to be able to have our version too.
A shipment of body-worn cameras is set to arrive in the spring. The cameras are typically small black boxes that fix to an officer's uniform. There are many different models. Lake Charles shopped around for the last year and a half, Dixon says.
A core group of 6 or 7 guys that wore them. We tested 3 different types, and they were very honest in their assessment. One of them, we had a problem where you had to physically download it, and almost minute for minute, and that was just not acceptable.
Most major cities across the state have either fully implemented the cameras or are in the stage of a pilot program. Shreveport, Bossier, Monroe, Alexandria, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Baton Rouge, Houma, and New Orleans. Dixon says his police department considers cameras as a way to exonerate police officers who have been falsely accused in the line of duty.
There's a lot of mistrust and defiance that I see around the country, and it's like almost to the point that they just don't want to take an officer's word for anything anymore. And, you know, it's a shame, but hey, if it's recorded, it is what it is.
Many smaller towns are using the devices as well. An officer-involved shooting in Marksville made headlines when it was caught on body cameras in November. With such widespread use, a legislative panel has been looking into setting standards across the state.
Somebody told me they had been waiting on me, is what they said. We were waiting on you, Councilwoman Marksville, and now State Rep.
Recently sworn-in State Representative C. Denise Marcel says she'll be involved in whatever the state decides to pass. When Marcel served on the Baton Rouge Metro Council, she led a study about body cameras.
There was the idea that the police handled certain people differently than others, stopped, frisked people, didn't have warrants for, in some instances. That was the community's perspective. On the other side of the coin was the police officer saying, you know, we're doing everything by the book, we're not treating anybody indifferently. I saw this as a win-win.
Footage sorts out the facts, Marcel says. And in the cities that she's visited for the study, she says she's seen evidence that cameras can de-escalate a situation.
Not only does the public react different, but the officer reacts different because the officer knows that it's being recorded.
Chief Dixon says he likes the cameras too. According to Dixon, much of the discussion around the state is not whether to get cameras, but how to implement them.
There's a lot of things you have to consider. You know, when do you turn them on? Do you give the officer the discretion to turn it off? If he turns it off, he's going to have to articulate why he's turning it off. There's all kinds of issues. The storage space issue.
Another issue is what the public is allowed to see. Scott Sternberg is general counsel for the Louisiana Press Association. Sternberg says the press has an important role in the administration of justice.
A lot of times people don't have time to go to criminal trials, so the newspapers go and cover the trial for the people, and that way people know that justice is being administered in some fair manner.
For that reason, Sternberg says the footage taken by body cameras should be public record. That worries Chief Dixon. He doesn't want his department accused of invading the public's privacy.
We hope there will be restrictions on the public record use. That basically, right now, until legislation's passed, I'm not releasing anything without a court order, period.
But Sternberg says public records law already accommodates protecting individuals' privacy.
The public records law was written to be all-encompassing, and one of the specific things that the public records law covers is recordings. So, I would argue that the body camera footage is a recording that would be subject to the public records law. Now, there are exceptions to the public records law.
And those exemptions still apply, like withholding information that would reveal the identity of a victim of sexual assault. Body camera technology is still in its nascent stages. One officer complained of the device turning off when brushed against accidentally. Like any technology, the devices will improve over time. Lake Charles delayed their purchase to take advantage of a new upgrade.
I just wasn't happy with the technology. I wasn't happy with having to download something almost minute for minute. It just didn't work. And the technology in the last year, and in fact, we've got to wait till April for the upgrade. So I think basically I wanted to be a steward for the public too, that if I bought something, I wanted to buy something that the taxpayers were not getting ripped off. It's 21st century. It's time to catch up.
Well, joining us to explore police body cameras in Louisiana is our studio audience. It includes members of the NAACP, police officers, and law students. We also have students from the Legislative Youth Advisory Council. Thanks to everyone for being here. Well, LPB asked viewers and social media followers to participate in an online survey on tonight's topic. Here's a look at some of the findings. Over 91% of respondents support the implementation of body cameras. But in terms of improving job performance, 23% of respondents said wearing them would make no difference. 72% said it would make officers more likely to do a good job. 59% said body cameras would make officers less likely to use excessive force. 14% said that excessive force would be more likely, and 18% said cameras would have no difference. When it comes to race relations, 2/3 of respondents said they have a fair amount or a great deal of confidence that police treat people of different races equally. 1/3 said they have just some or very little confidence. And I should note that 71% of those responding identified themselves as white. Will cameras make it more likely that police treat different races equally? 54% of respondents said yes. 40% said cameras would have no effect. So let's get started from there. Let's talk about, for example, what is the effect of body cameras on a police officer or on the citizens or maybe even on the criminals themselves. And we have here Jake, who is a police officer in New Orleans. Is that right, Jake?
Yes, sir.
Great. How do you think body cameras affect police officers in your force and the citizens that are with you?
I think police officers, when they wear them, they get the confidence that whatever happens is going to be taped. And that's always a plus for law enforcement. It's been overwhelmingly well received in New Orleans. I think on both sides, objectively, you can say that it leads to better behavior all around. It doesn't eliminate problems by any means, but it certainly, especially once the public is aware that all officers, say in New Orleans, for example, is wearing them, once it's out there, I think everybody takes it into account when they interact. Both sides of the equation.
It's been a positive experience so far.
Certainly.
And Jim is a former police officer.
Yes, sir.
You've never worn a body camera, have you?
Before my time.
Okay. What do you think the effect is on police officers and those in the force?
Yeah, I believe most police officers view it as a positive once they get over that initial reaction that, like I believe anybody would in the workplace, you're going to be taped your entire workday. There's that initial reaction, but I believe it's just another tool in the toolbox for law enforcement to use. It, in many cases, exonerates police officers from malicious and false accusations, and so I think it's been a positive for police officers.
How many of you would want to have your actions all day long videoed? Okay, not very much. So it is a workplace issue for police officers as well. And Michelle, you've actually written a little bit about this type of issue. What do you think? What do you think of the issue and the impact on people and privacy?
I think the first thing that struck me when I was researching in this area is how multidimensional it is, and that people don't think about. I mean, in the introduction, you guys raised a number of different issues, and it seems like an onion. You peel away a layer, and there's another layer to consider what effect it's going to be on who and money and privacy and the press, and it was one layer after another. It's a very interesting situation.
Go ahead, Stephen.
And
I should add, Stephen, you're with the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yes,
right?
the ACLU of Louisiana. Okay. I'd like to add to what Jake and Jim said about the effectiveness of the cameras. There's been some preliminary studies on the effect of the body cameras. And one study showed that there were 90% fewer complaints by citizens in the encounters with police officers who were wearing body cameras. So it is having this, calming effect on the situations. And also, in the same study, there was a 50% decrease in the use of force in the interactions. And so I think it's a profound effect, and it's been studied. Now, these are preliminary studies, but so far it's been very promising what they're showing.
So you're saying it's had a positive effect both on the police officers and on the citizens?
Yes.
Chandler?
Well, I mean, I think that what the police officers saying, what they're saying are right, that there is a positive effect, but I think that we should be reminded that these body cameras, like he also said, they don't eradicate the problem. And there's also training that has to coincide with this implementation of body cameras, because there's a need for training if we need body cameras. There's a need for police training, some diversity training for police to have when they implement these body cameras, because we see with the situation in Ohio with Ray Tinson, he was wearing a body camera, but that event still occurred. So I think with the implementation of body cameras, we still need diversity training among police.
Well, you're bringing up a really important issue, which is that do police officers treat different races differently, no matter what race the police officer is? And I wonder if anybody else has some thoughts of that. Reginald.
Oh, absolutely. I think the cameras will serve a purpose, but they're not a panacea, because even though they're going to be filmed or they're going to be in a position to where their actions are going to be videotaped, there's always an element of, well, my camera accidentally turned off, or I had a malfunction. Mm-hmm. The cameras primarily are for officers who are going to do the right thing anyway. But the officers who have a propensity to do the wrong thing, they'll find a way around the use of the cameras. In that instance, we as the community, speaking for the community, we have to monitor and be more proactive in making sure that there's no loopholes. Because I heard him say just now, the police chief said that he's going to be selective as to what information he devolves, and I think that right there sends up a red flag to us.
Right. Quad, do you agree with that?
As far as the body cameras, speaking from a civilian's point of view, I think that the things that will be recorded on camera, such as demeanor, posture, actions, they will all play a pivotal role in the way the court rules on certain things. But as far as like my friend Hill was saying, the body cameras for the police officers, it'll put a lot more pressure on the integrity, so we weed the bad guys out, weed the good guys out.
But what about the privacy issues? I mean, this camera is on. Police officers go into some fairly private environments, into homes sometimes. What do we think about privacy and whether or not that should be protected. Patrick?
Well, I guess I kind of want to go back to what we were talking about earlier. I think there's, without a doubt, that people's behavior will be affected by a camera, and an officer being able to turn on and off a camera, I mean, it's going to affect their behavior, but I guess that kind of makes me think, what happens if it's always on, to where because we go to a public place, we're probably going to be filmed on surveillance, but we're not constantly reminded you're being filmed. But when you turn on a switch, you know, okay, I'm being filmed, got to act right or whatever. So I guess it opens up the privacy issues of them just walking through the mall and seeing people there, or going into their house and seeing evidence of other things.
Anybody else feel a little invaded by the idea of having these cameras on? Stephen, let me see if Haley or Tat want to talk about that. So.
Well, I mean, I believe if it's in a public place, then that there is no guarantee that one's privacy will be assured. But if it's in a private place, it also depends on where is it. Is it in a mental institution? Is it in a public school? Is it at someone's houses?
And maybe that should be an issue. Rashad?
Yes, I think that there just needs to be clear rules and guidelines for officers when it comes to speaking with an informant or an underage child. Those are important things to have in the rules and guidelines as far as an officer's responsibility goes.
What about witnesses? Is a witness compromised if they're speaking to an officer, and then what if that becomes a public record? Jim, real quick, why don't you jump in on that?
One of the big questions is whether it should be a continuous feed or whether the officer should have the discretion to turn the camera on and off. Speaking as a citizen, not as a former police officer, I don't believe I should have to give up my expectation of privacy simply because I need the services of a police officer. I believe I should have the right as a citizen to tell that police officer, I'd like you to turn off your body camera before you enter my home.
I guess it becomes then a question of whether they turn it off or whether in the open records process, when it's released, that somehow or another can be redacted or changed, and that becomes a big issue. Go ahead.
If I could add, you made an excellent point about the onion, and you as well. One of the things we're grappling with in New Orleans, and we have a model policy which these guys helped with, which has been really successful. But as we go forward, about 2 years into body cameras, we see so many circumstances that you couldn't anticipate. Mental homes, hospitals, what if you go to a school? Any number of situations, and then the thing about right now, I don't think anybody really can demand that you turn the camera off.
Right.
Yeah.
About it, Stephen, you want to jump in?
Several things. I think that we at the ACLU we are concerned about the body cameras being on at all times. We don't want general surveillance of society, and so a rule needs to be put in place where the body camera comes on when you're having an investigatory stop or detention, and then it doesn't turn off till the end of that. So that's how you limit how often that's done. And then also you have rules, legislation. Rashad, I'm glad you brought that up. You have very specific rules about what goes on when a witness is being talked to who maybe wants to remain anonymous, somebody who wants to give a tip anonymously, a victim. You have very specific rules saying that, they have a right to say, I want to have the camera off right now, officer,
right.
And it is turned off. So these privacy concerns are real, but they all can be addressed with proper legislation.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore police POV, body cameras in Louisiana. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing police body cameras. Joining us now is our panel. Franz Borghardt serves as chair of the state committee looking into body camera policy. He is also a member of the Louisiana Public Defender Board. Alfreda Tillman Bester is general counsel for the Louisiana State Conference of the NAACP. She also hosts Perspective, a weekly community interest talk show in Baton Rouge. Darrell Bosco is the president of the Louisiana Fraternal Order of Police. Mr. Bosco has served with the Pineville Police Department for 22 years. Bryn Stoll is a reporter who covers crime, criminal justice, and public safety in Baton Rouge and Acadiana for The Advocate. So before we go to our audience for questions, I want to ask each of you just to make a few remarks about your perspective on this issue from your organizations. And you, Mr. Borghardt, are on the state committee looking at this. Just what exactly is that state committee trying to do?
The task force was charged with using the various stakeholders in the area of this implementation to basically come together and make a recommendation to the legislature after doing research on costs, privacy issues, implementation, and the various issues that surround it. So that's our task.
Well, good luck with that. And Mrs. Bester from the NAACP, your perspective.
Yes. Well, we're very excited about the probability, and I said it, probability, yes, of implementation across the state. My community looks at law enforcement a little bit different than the majority community. Generally, when the police comes into my community, they come into my community to control. The protect and serve is generally secondary in my community. So when we look at body cameras, we look at keeping everybody honest. Not that the police aren't, but for every community, for every citizen, perception is reality. And the perception in my community is that we are treated as second class. And I think that the concern about de-escalation and the challenges of actually interacting with the police, we have people in our community who are actually afraid of the police, and that shouldn't be in this country. And I think that the body cameras and the use of body cameras will keep everybody honest, because not all of the citizens are honest and not all of the police officers are honest. And I think that the camera gives a totally objective view of what is happening, and that's why we're very excited about the possibility.
Good summary. And Mr. Bosco.
Yes, the Fraternal Order of Police has been one of the rank and file organizations that has been first to help develop model policy for agencies across the state, New Orleans being the chief one and the first one here. Our concerns are privacy issues, is at the forefront of the officers, and some of the things that were spoken on the audience earlier is that, you know, that idea of privacy of in a home, the privacy of if it's recording the whole shift for the officer, you know, what type of privacy are they going to be expected to have at the end of the day?
Right, exactly. And now, for the newspaper point of view, the media point of view, Mr. Stoll.
Well, I guess speaking for myself as a newspaper journalist, one of the interesting opportunities, I guess, that's being presented by widening implementation of body cameras with different police departments is the chance to sort of clarify previously hotly contested interactions between officers and the public, which, you know, in the past have generally led to very conflicting accounts of exactly what happened and a lot of questions, and the chance to shed a little bit more light on it. And as a journalist, I'll be very interested to see how legislators here and individual law enforcement agencies address the degree to which they're going to allow public access or not allow public access to those videos.
Well, Edmund, we have a really good panel here. Here's your chance to get your best shot in at the folks who really have a grip on this.
Well, I appreciate it. But I guess one thing, I've listened to all the issues that everyone has brought forth, and I'm wondering, are we being stalled in the pursuit of perfection? And what I mean by that, do you think that we're looking for this perfect document, this perfect legislation, at the cost of stalling the implementation of the body cameras? Why wouldn't it be better to have a document, have it be a living, breathing document, and have it evolve through the court system as we go forward, because as technology increases and all of that? So I guess the main thing is, why are we stalling in the implementation when history has shown us that we're not going to have a perfect drafted legislation first round? Let's let that thing move forward and evolve as we go forward.
Mr. Borghardt, do you want to try to address the need or not a need for legislation?
Well, the legislature decided, for whatever reason, to form the task force. And I will tell you that the core issues that I'm seeing, because I've asked each member of the task force, people from criminal justice, people from civil rights, civil liberties, defense attorneys like myself, we have a holistic approach, and I've asked them all to tell me what the issues are. And it really is a core set of issues. One, how are we going to fund the data storage? That's the biggest issue, is at the end of the day, there's a universal desire to have these devices, but how are we going to fund the data storage? Two, do we need to create a new public records infrastructure, or is what we have now adequate and sufficient? Most of the members of the task force, without having met to discuss this specific issue, have submitted documentations where, yes, the current infrastructure is good. We are going to haggle about issues with regard to, will law enforcement officers be able to review these cameras in a controlled manner? How are we going to address the privacy rights of third-party witnesses, third-party individuals that are not suspects or witnesses that are just in the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak? So I guess to answer your question, stalling, I don't know why the legislature delayed, other than I think they wanted to get it right, and I think this task force is going to submit a suggestion to the legislature where, if we can find the funding, the policy and other implements or other parts of this process should fall in place. I don't think necessarily you have to create new law, though.
Yeah, of course, Edmund, you're assuming the legislature might actually improve the situation. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case or not.
I guess the thing is how many people, because if you take Ms. Bessick's position that people feel oppressed and that the communities, there's this unequal treatment and they're there to control, so how many people have to be controlled while we're waiting to get this situation perfected?
Mrs. Bosco, sure. Go ahead. Take a shot.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that we're not necessarily, Edmund, waiting for perfection. I call him Edmund because he's my friend. We're not necessarily waiting for perfection, but you know that in every public policy, there's politics. And I think that in forming the task force, the legislature was very deliberate in assuring that all perspectives were present. I am a member of the task force, and the people who are there are law enforcement people there as well, and they have a different perspective. They have some concerns about privacy, but these are the same people who take your blood, who ask you to breathe into a machine, who take your fingerprints and your DNA. It's not just about privacy. Yes, there are situations where we don't want to see us have complete access to everything, but there are exceptions already built into the public records law that say that when there is an active investigation going on, there are certain things that are not available to the public. So, you know, all of those issues are going to be fleshed out. We're not going to have a perfect document. Nothing in law is perfect. If it were, we wouldn't have need for a legislature every year.
That's right. Thank you, Ms. Bester. And I have Bester, Bosco, and Borghardt and Bren. So I got a lot of B's going on. Taryn, you wanted to add into this.
Considering that it sounds like this is being approached from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, what I guess is ultimately the goal? If the cost is too high, then ultimately we're not going to have body cameras, or is there going to be some sort of way that we're going to try to find funding, like you say, to do storage of this and ultimately have the body cameras anyway?
That's such a good question. All the costs, the acquisition, the storage, then the redaction and all of that. How about you, Mr. Bosco? You want to take a shot at that?
A couple of the things that we've talked about is that the cost of the camera is relatively inexpensive, I guess, for to use when you're looking at the cost. The storage is what the issue is, and having an employee, some type of governmental employee, going in and being able to redact whether it's a juvenile involved or a victim of domestic violence or that person that is the witness that all of a sudden gives you the information on a murder. You know, we allow Crime Stopper tips to come in anonymously to protect those people that can later become informants for law enforcement. To go back on one of the other questions, when you look across the state at it, there are a lot of agencies, and I think in the opening piece it talked about that you have agencies that are already implementing or in the process of doing so. One of the things that we've suggested on the task force is that immediately almost, or within this, the state can become a repository or a library for best practices, for model policies, that if you have a smaller agency or even a larger agency that is looking at it, and we can have the documentation from Lake Charles, from New Orleans, from those different areas to help in that situation.
We might have different views on whether the state, how much the state should get involved in those local issues and setting an example, but that's a really good point. And Donovan, you wanted to get a question in with this panel on that.
Well, I'm an attorney with the Fraternal Order of Police, and as such, I represent hundreds of police officers every year. I think more than 400 last year. And
you represent them in cases where they might have a problem in court,
and
right?
in disciplinary matters and so forth.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court in the case that controls the analysis of police use of force specifically went out of their way to say that when we're looking at an officer's use of force, we need to do so from the perspective of an objective officer on the scene as opposed to using 20/20 hindsight. So my question is, how do we avoid using the cameras as a function of 20/20 hindsight in analyzing police use of force?
Well, it's a very good question. But go ahead, then I also want to ask Mr. Stoll that same question.
Okay. My answer would be that decision was wrong and that we shouldn't not use it to use 20/20. Police officers have been conditioned to say certain things. Every time there's a shooting, first of all, they feared for their lives. Secondly, someone was charging at them. Thirdly, someone came for their gun. I don't believe that we have that many police officers who are so afraid that the very first thing that they do is to pull their gun and use deadly force. I just don't believe that we have that many scared police officers. But if we do, we definitely need to recruit some other people who are not afraid of the citizens of this state and this nation, and we need some real training. And when we talk about diversity training, everyone thinks that we're talking about bringing in, but I'm talking about training that teaches people to be sensitive to the community that they serve. If they are afraid of the people that they serve, they need to either get out of law enforcement altogether, or they need to learn the community that they serve, so that the first thing they do when they approach a car, depending on who's in it, is to pull a gun.
That's great. Let me let Mr. Stoll jump in here. Now, most of us haven't watched videos from body cameras. Now, a lot of people in here probably have, because you've been involved. And we're used to like watching sports events like football. And a lot of times, was that call right? Was that really a touchdown or not? And so they have all these different camera angles. I mean, is that an issue, or you only just have a piece of the action each time, Mr. Stoll?
Well, I mean, certainly in all the body camera programs that I've seen rolled out in any department, I mean, you're usually talking about a single body-worn camera that's usually worn somewhere around the torso of the officer. So you're only getting one image there. The image quality is not always fantastic. I mean, it also is, I mean, they're fallible devices, and it also usually depends on the officer.
And you've seen some of these yourself, right?
Well, I haven't. Not in my reporting.
No?
I have not covered a case yet where the camera footage has been released to the public.
About it. Well, Haley, here you go. You had a question earlier that I really want to let you get to, so why don't you let them have it?
I feel like there's been a lot of question lately in the discussion about different policy, things like when they can turn them on, who has the discretion to do that, if it'll be open for public access. My question is, should it be regulated federally, or should more control be given at the state and individual department level?
Oh gosh, Edmund already got the state in on this. Now you want to get the federal government. Who wants to? You want to try to answer that, Mr. Bosco? Or
sure. And I guess it's going to come to an issue of what the community of what my the panelist next to me is talking about. A lot of those questions I think needs to be answered within a community that the police department is actually serving. You know, there's a process, a political process that is in effect, that you have a mayor, a council, or parish president, or parish council that the citizens elect in order to serve that community. And those should be the people that is legislating, making the policy, making the rules, is the people that's governed by that community. I don't think that this, like anything in law enforcement, there is a cookie cutter answer that fits any of it. So it would be something that is different across communities in America.
So you need that flexibility. Michael, do you agree with that? And
I'm from Dark, Louisiana, and I've been living in South Louisiana for some time, and it's just like night and day. Just as you have different cultures, you also have persons that think differently in other parts of the state. There needs to be some uniformity. We were talking earlier about I was driving through a small town, got stopped by a police officer, and what he really wanted, he didn't really want me, he wanted what I had, something economically. That's a lie. That's real. That exists in 2016.
I'm sorry. What exactly did he want?
He wanted some money.
He wanted some money.
He wanted some money for his little town.
Uh-huh.
But that exists real. That was 2016. So when he says let the individual towns regulate, well, let the regulators be regulated.
Yeah, I guess we should all have body cameras while we're driving, so we can just have it on the odometer the whole time. The speedometer the whole time, see how fast we're going. Yeah. Michelle.
See, this is the onion again, right? So he's talking about he's getting stopped so that money can be raised for his town. All right, our public defender system in Louisiana is funded by traffic tickets. All right, so here's the circle and here's the layers of the onion. To pay for the body cameras that we want, you got to give tickets to raise the money for the public defender system, then to be able to, if that's what's decided. I mean, one suggestion is that you have a defendant, the defendant needs a copy of that film to defend himself in the trial. Who pays for that? So one suggestion, and it's being done right now, is the defendant pays to get a copy of the film.
Yeah.
Right now, we can't fund in this state our public defender
And let's
system.
let Mr. Borghardt, because
Mr.
he has
Borghardt.
two hats. He's on the state commission, but you're also with the public defenders.
That is correct. She is absolutely correct. It is perverse that we fund the majority of the money for public defenders in this state on the backs of traffic tickets.
Yes. Both folks.
Yeah.
Yes.
My hesitance, and this is me wearing my hat as a defense attorney, I don't want those accused of a crime that have a presumption of innocence to have to fund the evidence that may exonerate them or convict them. Now, if we're talking about that person's convicted and it's a part of court costs in the back end or part of some kind of conditions for probation, that's different. But there are several jurisdictions that charge defendants for videos, dash cam videos, and essentially you have to pay for access to evidence, and I'm fundamentally against that. So really the onion is that to fund these devices, which goes back to what you were asking, is we're going to have to look at how we want to fund the justice system as a whole. Where do we want our money coming from for public defenders? Where do we want our money coming from for these devices which protect everybody? And prioritize. And if we're not going to prioritize, then, and by the way, I'm concerned because if we implement all these wonderful things, that's less money that's going to come to the public defenders. So it's the stakeholders at the table who want these things are also very cognizant that come with a cost. So
great, Mr. Stoll.
Well, and I noticed that you mentioned dash cameras here, and that's a point that I sort of wanted to address. I mean, some of these challenges that we're talking about aren't necessarily entirely new for police departments. A lot of departments have been dealing with dash cameras in their vehicles for quite some time.
And state police have cameras in their cars as well.
Right, and so that has already raised to a degree these questions of public records, these questions of how are these going to be used in the court system, data retention, and they've already broached the issue of departments have had to have large computer storage. Now, when you talk about adding a body camera program, that's amping up the amount of storage required greatly, and there's certain other questions. The privacy issue becomes much larger because you usually don't drive a police patrol car into someone's house. But
Amen. We got lots of people who want to talk here. Quick, Jim, and then we want to go
just
to
on the question of a state mandated uniformity. of policy. I believe in response to Donovan's question earlier, one of your panelists said the United States Supreme Court got it wrong in its analysis of use of force. Then how are we ever going to agree on a state-mandated uniformity when we can't even agree that the United States Supreme Court has set the law of the land?
No, I didn't say that the Supreme Court didn't have the authority to set the law of the land. What I said was I believe that their analysis in this instance in determining that we can't look back at what a police officer did and whether or not it was reasonable, that is not in my opinion, in my learned opinion, if you will, that is not in accordance with U.S. law,
right,
and our Constitution.
Well, I think the elephant in the room is what policies are going to be implemented in Louisiana, because in other states, like say California, you have policies where the public can't even get access to the footage, or even more kind of perverse policies where a policeman gets to view footage in a use of force of report before he even writes the report. I mean, won't policies like that undermine public trust with the police officers and undermine the accuracy of those reports? So what type of policies are we going to have in Louisiana? Are we going to have policies like that are guised, that are presented under the guise of protecting public privacy, but really what they do is give police the authority and the right to kind of put out what footage they want and pick and choose who sees what footage?
That's a really good point, and it's one of the concerns we have. I mean, there's also the concern that the state will, in its policies, will create mandates that will be expensive for those local police departments and sheriffs to implement, and so it could become a real burden on all of them. So you have an unfunded mandate in some.
There's a constitutional issue. Can the legislature mandate that a municipality do something, especially do something without funding? Constitutionally, probably not. They could do it through a funding stream requirement, like if you don't have these devices, then we're not going to give you money for this. I don't know if anybody wants to see that happen. Mainly what the task force has been looking at is state police, because we're fairly confident that the state police can be regulated by the legislature. So it gets to be a constitutional issue with regard to what's the scope of what the legislature is going to do. Now, the legislature task force might say this is a best practices policy, in as much as we may or may not agree on that.
Right.
This is the policy that we're recommending for all the stakeholders, and then those municipalities can either follow it or not follow it. There's, of course, an effect if they don't follow the state recommended policy.
And there's also the locals. I mean, Baton Rouge is trying to build a strong policy, and I think a lot of people believe its policy will be admired and looked at very carefully by other jurisdictions in the state. I mean, why wouldn't a jurisdiction look at another jurisdiction rather than looking to the state, who might have all kinds of motivations about how they want to implement these? Mr. Bosco.
Well, I mean, I think that's what is going on right now. New Orleans has looked at Baton Rouge's policy, and Baton Rouge is looking at Lake Charles's policy, and there's a lot of sharing that's going on. And to a certain extent of what he's brought up about the cameras earlier, we have to remember cameras are nothing that are new. It's just a little bit more that we've actually had. As far as you have to come at it, I feel that no matter how, it's an evidentiary tool is what a body camera is. There's a process, for example, of vouchering narcotics through the police system all the way to court. The body camera, or any type of video, is the same. There's going to have to be a vouchering process that is solid and as free from manipulation as possible to assure to the public and anybody that's arrested or the newspaper people or media people that are looking at it, that is the true and most accurate form of evidence that's there.
Right. Reginald, let Reginald, Chandler, let Reginald jump in, because he's next.
I'm hearing about policy, I'm hearing about funding, the cost, and what have you. Let's just look at it from a perspective of a brother from the hood. Okay, what he's concerned about is this officer going to be trained in cultural sensitivity? Is this officer going to be trained in de-escalation? Is he going to actively try to develop trust in the community? It doesn't matter to me about a camera if the officer's mentality and approach to dealing with African American people has not changed. So that's the issue that I want to interject into policy. Where does that come into play?
But yeah, and you're sort of asking, will the cameras maybe help change some of that behavior? Any of the panelists want to answer that question? Will it actually help change behavior?
I think we would probably all agree that the cameras do affect behavior. Now, some people are going to be themselves whether on camera or not, and that's just something that we're going to have to deal with. And I'm to be sure, I'm certain that certain task force members are going to bring that as an issue of, we have these devices, but what about training officers to be better officers? Now, that may not be the job of this task force, but it's certainly in the background of, look, you could have the best equipment in the world, but if they're not using it right, it's useless.
Yeah, that's right. Tat, up here.
Hi, I have a question. In terms of the cost and privacy of the body cameras, like, is there any particular policy that you are deciding or you are going to enact on whether cameras are going to be on and off, and that if a camera is off and something happens, like a racial incident that one of the other person was talking about, if that happens, then is there any policies that deal with these kind of issues?
It's this policy of when you turn it on, when you turn it off. I mean, who wants to address that, Mr. Bosco, or and you too, Mrs. Bester? Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, but maybe Jake could say something.
Jake, our police officer from New Orleans.
So
go ahead.
Those things are specifically written into our policy, and it's very broad. New Orleans policy essentially says that anytime an officer is on the way to a call before arriving, it has to be turned on. Anytime they interact with a citizen, for any reason, it has to be on. And for them to turn that camera off while still on a scene or still interacting with somebody, they have to specifically ask a supervisor permission to turn it off.
But we don't have to know what donuts they're ordering, right? Is that right?
No.
Okay.
No.
So you don't have to turn
on public access.
What about when a police officer is doing the extra duty? You know how a lot of police officers have to moonlight and take these other jobs because unfortunately they're probably not paid enough. What happens then? I mean, obviously, is there a body camera that should be on during that type of activity when they're just being a security guard?
Well, I mean, I would think that it's going to be the policy of what Jake was talking about is that if I'm working a supermarket detail, and if I'm just standing in front of the store being the visual presence, then no. But as soon as I have an interaction, if somebody approaches me, or if it's one of the clerks or cashiers comes and says, "Hey, I think this guy over here is stealing, a ribeye steak," well, then I activate the camera and go to it.
Mrs. Bester, do you agree?
I do agree. I think that if an officer is giving the appearance that he is in his official capacity, because that's the authority that he uses to approach a citizen, then he needs to utilize that camera.
Elizabeth, what is it in this conversation we haven't covered that's bothering you?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues I'm having was with the cost. I mean, obviously, but even if we did get funding for this, someone would have to edit it, maybe from the government, maybe from the police department. And what's the point of having these cameras that the police officers wear if either the footage is not available to the public, or parts can be edited out by people who are partial to what's happening there and may edit out things that are critical evidence in a case.
I would just like
to
go
ahead,
the
Stephen.
Cost issue that's been coming up throughout the program.
I hope I'll get back to her point too.
The task force that is looking into the cost looks at all the cost.
Right.
What are the costs? For example, there was a study done on the use of body cameras on police that showed that assaults on police officers went way down. What's the value of that? Mm-hmm. What's the value of the peace of mind of people in the community who are going like, okay, these officers have cameras on. I feel better about what's going on here. What's all the deterrence that goes on, of bad behavior by civilians or by police officers that's prevented. and all of those costs that can be avoided if you have these police cameras. I hope that is factored in, because look, one single case of police misconduct is hundreds of thousands of dollars. It might be $1 million. And if you can reduce those costs, I think that it makes the cost of having the cameras look a lot less, troublesome.
But Elizabeth is bringing up a really important point, is that you have a video that has been taken, and then there's the other end of it when it finally gets released for some type of evidence, or when it goes out on a public records request, or for whatever reason. What happens to that video in between? And we know that a lot of departments, they go through a redacting process, maybe an editing process, like you say, and that could be altered. And this is a very critical policy issue that Elizabeth has brought up. Does anybody want to address that? I think all three of you want to address that. But let's start with Mr. Stoll.
Well, I mean, to address the editing part, I don't think I've seen a policy from a police department, I could be wrong, that allows for editing of it. I mean, if for no other reason,
actually chopping something out.
If for no other reason, then these are pieces of evidence that could potentially end up in a court proceeding, and chain of custody is going to be incredibly important.
But you do sometimes see them like fuzz out a face or something for privacy reasons.
That is going to be becoming, I think, a key part of a lot of these policies, because first off, police departments are not really equipped to do that, and it can be extremely time-consuming and expensive. And so that is the issue we're going to end up getting at the public records.
Right.
Once you get to the point of either media or private citizens, attorneys requesting these as public records, that can become incredibly expensive if they decide that lots of faces have to be redacted constantly. That can really drive up the bill and make these sort of unattainable to most people.
Well, and there's also not just when that record goes public, but when internally maybe there's some supervision of officers, and these become part of the personnel record, or they become a part of disciplinary actions on the part. So what about that issue?
Well, usually, and I'll go back to one thing. Usually, with a records management system or any type of system, you're going to have controlled access to begin with, of who is at different security levels within the system, who can log in and do what you're talking about. So there is, most records management systems and a lot of the commercial vendors that I've looked at, they have some type of process that it's an audit. That, Darrell Bosco logged into the system at this time, and he looked at video 725, and he did this to video 725. You've got to remember, we're not talking about plugging a camera into your personal laptop and then clipping it, on a MacBook and doing what I want to later on. There's a system that's going to look at all of that. Addressing Mr. Reginald's comment earlier, you've got to remember, and I agree, I understand what he's saying, and I do. We have to look at this from two different things. You're looking at training and a body camera. A body camera as an evidentiary tool is here. If you're looking at training and want police officers throughout the state to do more training, we have the Post Counsel, which is the Training Standards Council, that requires a certain number of hours that is set up by the legislative, a different task force that does that.
Okay.
That sets what training those officers are required to receive every year. So if the diversity training, that's an answer or a question that needs to be posed to that task force in order for them to change those policy or the policy of what has to be taught for the upcoming year for police.
Well, at any rate, I mean, I think in all these communities, we should remember.
They very well could work in conjunction, but I'm just saying as it's set up today, you're talking about two different task forces.
In all these communities, the public can participate in these task force. They can come and they can testify. They can offer their opinions both on the state level and on the local level. But I wanted to get back. We only have a little bit of time left, but I want to get this issue because it's very controversial. Mr. Chandler brought it up a little while ago, but I want to ask Jake, what about having that video, the police officer being able to use it when he's writing his report and trying to clarify what happened? Is that something that you want to see happen, or is that a bad idea?
At face value, it's a good idea. I can say that in New Orleans, and again, I can only speak to our processes. In major use of force incidents, we don't watch the body cameras before we give a statement on that.
Right.
And I would caution, if I could, something is I think a lot of people think body cameras are there for those negative police-public interactions, and then we want to see huge, very wide-open release policies. Remember, by and large, that we all have family members, and I would caution just putting a citizen's hat on, is that a lot of what body cameras capture are, maybe we have family members that are mentally ill, we have suicides in New Orleans, all of those responses are on body camera. And I don't think anybody wants to see that becoming public entertainment. And that is part of it. We can't segregate use of force from every other call type.
And especially with reality shows the way they are now. And make it real quick. We've got to go out.
But with the mentally ill, we've seen numerous cases in which it appears that there has been excessive force with the mentally ill because police officers seemingly are not adequately trained to deal with the mentally ill. One real quick thing about record retention and cataloging. It's not as difficult or as cumbersome as people think it would be to retain these records because there are digital markings that we can utilize for that. And in terms of the records retention, we could put a policy in to say that we'll keep it for a certain period of time or until a court proceeding regarding that incident has been completed.
Thank you, Ms. Britt. Great point. And thank you, Jake and Jim, and for y'all's service and the police force. But we've run out of time for our question and answer segment. So we'd like to thank our panelists, Mr. Borghardt, Mrs. Bester, Mr. Bosco, and Mr. Stoll for their insight on this month's topic. And when we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Robert, lively conversation, but one of the issues, of course, is who's going to pay for all this? Many options out there, but perhaps we're all going to pay.
Oh, especially that other guy over there behind the tree.
Behind the
He's
tree.
The one who's going to pay.
Exactly.
So.
But I think I look forward to seeing the entire task force report.
Yeah, and all these. This is a really controversial issue, but I think people are really invigorated by all the different levels of argument that are going on.
Absolutely. Here, so. And the onion, I like that whole concept. You keep peeling it back and getting more and more issues, right?
It is one of those issues.
Right.
Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/Public Square. And while you're there, take this month's survey. You can view additional sound bites and comment on tonight's show. We'd love to hear from you.
Indeed. On next month's Louisiana Public Square, we'll delve into the rising cost of health care. Why is health care so expensive? How are the costs of private and public health care linked? What can be done to stabilize costs for Louisiana residents? Tune in Wednesday, February 24th for more. Thanks for watching this evening. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.